Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm going to briefly introduce Don Passey, who all you can see right now. So Professor Don Passey is a founding co-director of the TEL Center, which is Center for Technology Enhanced Learning at the Department of Educational Research. And he had acted as director and co-director for many, many years for that center. And he had also directed the TEL doctoral program upstairs. And he's currently on sabbatical. And thanks for doing this for us, although you're away. But I believe that you're going to be back in a couple of months and work for the program. And so he's also a book author of the book called Inclusive Technology Enhanced Learning, Overcoming Cognitive, Physical, Emotional, and Geographic Challenges, which is available as ebook through library, but you can also buy it. And so we're gonna move on to. So he has been with us for many, many years at the department. He has been doing a lot of different research projects, but his main research concern is how different types of digital technologies support and enhance learning and teaching activities, both in formal and informal educational settings. And he is currently particularly interested in supporting students and teachers who are in remote or distributed learning setting. And that's all I think I prepared. So shall we just start? You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes, I will remind you when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, that's very good. Okay, thank you, Kunmi. Hello, everyone. And thank you for coming along. I'm going to stand for 2 reasons. One, I can see you all if I stand, which I prefer. And the other reason is I think my voice will carry better if I stand rather than if I sit. But don't please take my standing as being anything to do with domination. But I did propose this hypothesis beforehand, that actually if you stand as a speaker, you might gain harder questions than if you sit. So I will be prepared for harder questions at the end of the session. Okay. So thank you, Kyungmi, for your kind introduction. I should also say that in addition to that, I've actually been at Lancaster for quite some time, and in all of that time, actually for about 25 years or more, I've been looking at the field of TEL, so technology enhanced learning. So if I don't know something about it now, I probably never will. So what I'm going to talk about today in this seminar is really something of a review of what I've seen and are seeing currently within the TEL field. But I also want to make it in terms of some form of strategic analysis. I am looking at it from a strategic viewpoint in terms of future direction. So, which is my current interest and concern. What is happening within the field of digital technologies with learning? Where are we with them, and where is this field going to go in the future, and how are we going to conceive it? So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. So let's see if the technology will work. So I'm going to talk to this topic, which is about digital technologies. And I'm going to ask really this fundamental question, which I think is particularly fundamental at this time. Are digital technologies enhancing learning, or are they shifting learning behaviours? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to try and look at these questions, not necessarily within this order, and there will be some overlap in terms of how I look at these, but these are the sorts of questions that I want to ask. The first is, what evidence do we have that suggests that digital technologies do enhance learning? And then, on the other side of that, what is the evidence to suggest that they don't enhance learning? Which I think is a fair question to ask. I think that, and I'll come back to that. The third one is, why is it that teachers and learners continue to say things like, the technologies are helping them? That's very, very common, actually, although actually it's also as common for teachers and learners to not use technologies after a time. and I can talk about that as well. And then what evidence do we have? Is it widely available? What width of or depth of evidence do we have or not have? And what does that mean in terms of where our thinking is and our conceptions are with regard to this field? And then I want to come to a strategic conclusion, if you like, which is to come out of that analysis of those questions and to ask, do we really need to reconceptualise our understanding and perception of this term, technology-enhanced learning? And that's an interesting one, because in one way this was, I wouldn't say it was sparked by a comment, but about a year, 18 months ago, I was giving a presentation in London at a conference, and someone from a university responded to something that I said and said, well, don't you think that TEL is actually going to disappear? Don't you think that this is going to be something which is actually going to just go out of the whole educational system? Is it not going to be replaced by something else? To which I answered, I don't think so, but I do think that we need to think about what the term actually means. So to some extent, I'm going to think about what the definition means of technology-enhanced learning. What do we actually mean by that? And I'm going to look at that through the evidence that we have in some respects. But I'm also going to say, so what? Okay? So if we start to question the definition of TEL for the future, what does that mean and where are we going with it? The evidence of impact, of positive impact upon learning, actually comes from a range of studies which by comparison are not recent. There's less evidence currently within the literature of the positive impact of digital technologies on learning than there has been in the past. Now, to some extent, I think that can be explained. But it is true that the sorts of controlled studies that were done to try and highlight the difference between learners using technology and not using technology were mainly done round about 10 to 20 years ago. That, of course, was a time when those technologies were being introduced. And I'll come back to that, because I think that's something which is fundamentally important. But there were studies that showed these significant statistical differences. However, there are other studies that don't show that depth, that height of statistical difference. And Tamim and colleagues of hers did a second-order meta-analysis a few years ago to look at this whole question of whether the evidence was there about the impact of technologies on learning. And her conclusion was particularly interesting, which was that when she accounted for effects and random effects, what she found was that actually the effect size was low. Now, you can generally get away in education with an effect size of being something like 0.4 as having some level of significance. She found 0.3 to 0.35, which is low. She regarded as low, or, as she said, moderate at best. So there's something which is interesting. If one looks across that field at that second-order meta-analysis level, she was finding that actually the outcomes in terms of statistical difference were not that huge. And I don't want to go into the reasons why it's difficult to identify impact, but it is. Okay, it's actually not an easy thing to do. And I will refer to some of that during the rest of what I talk about. But there is a literature on this which indicates why it's difficult to do this, and I'll add to some of those as we go on. If we look at the no impact or negative impact on learning, what we find is that actually there are very, very few published studies that show this. Very, very few. Now some, and you might call them skeptics or cynics, would say that people don't publish if there's no impact or negative impact. However, in my experience, and I mean, I've told you that I've been in this field for 25 years. In my experience, it's actually very, very rare to come across a situation where there is negative impact. Negative. You can come across situations where there is no impact or very, very limited impact. But to get negative impact is rare, very, very rare. And the interesting thing is that the negative findings are usually actually not that much concerned with learning. They're concerned with other factors around learning. So what you find is that they don't actually report on the learning being affected. What they report on are things like technology reliability, which is actually nothing to do with learning. Or they report on technology application, i.e. the applicability of it to a particular activity or outcome. Again, that's not to do with the learning, that's to do with the misappropriation in the first place. They report on things like pedagogical appropriateness or misappropriateness. So what you're getting here is that when negative aspects are being reported, they're often not about learning at all. They're about the factors that go around that learning. They're to do with contextual factors that are affecting it. And I think that Tamim and colleagues actually sum this up really, really well in their paper when they say aspects of the goals of instruction, pedagogy, teacher effectiveness, subject matter, age level, fidelity of technology implementation, and possibly other factors may represent more powerful influences on effect sizes than the nature of the technology intervention. So what they were saying from this meta-analysis was actually that, in their view, it was the factors around the technology which were as important, if not more important. And other authors have actually gone on to show that if you then look at the positive influence of those surrounding factors, then the effect size goes up considerably. In other words, it is a combination of the technology with the surrounding factors, which appears to be important in terms of impact upon learning. And I'll come back to that. But the point that I want to make here at the moment is that actually negative results are often not to do with learning itself. And actually students and teachers don't tend to report on negative effects on learning. They talk about the surrounding factors. If we think about the origins of evidence for what we look at in terms of learning with technologies, we have four origins of that evidence. We've got evidence about the affordances of the technologies, i.e. what is it that they can do? What is it that people see in them that can be applied to a learning situation? What is it about that physical resource or that soft resource that can be used in some way? Uses, i.e. how to use it, how you use it in terms of activity, how you apply it into an activity, or how you apply it through pedagogy, through teaching. Then the third is to do with outcomes, i.e. when you've identified those affordances and looked at the uses, what is it that comes out of it at the end when the activity has been undertaken? So we have evidence about those, and then we have evidence about the impact, i.e. the actual hard evidence of the learning that has resulted. What effect has it upon the learning? And that's the harder one. And what tends to happen is that when you look at the studies, you're moving from qualitative approaches through to quantitative approaches. So affordances and uses tend to look at it from a qualitative point of view, whereas outcomes and impacts tend to look at it more increasingly from a quantitative point of view. So what we have essentially is not only four ranges of evidence, but we have four approaches that match those methodologically. if we look at the state of play, what we find is that we have far more evidence about affordances and uses than we have about the other two. If you look at the range of studies that are published, the first two, the affordances and uses, tend to be more. Outcomes is then at the next level, and it's the impact, the statistical evidence, that we have less of. So what we have at the moment is if you like, a distribution of evidence which tends to look at things from an affordance and use point of view, then outcomes, but less in terms of impact. So that itself interests me. You know, I ask the question, why? You know, there are simple ways of answering that, I think, which is to say, you know, it's easier to do the first two than it is to do the second two. But that's a bit simple, I think. That's actually rather simplistic. And I think it doesn't tend to uncover what is at the root of this difference, about the reasons why this is happening. Now, if we look at what's happening at that interface, then in order to move from affordances to uses, there has to be something there about the perceptions of use, either ways of translating those affordances into uses. There has to be a way of thinking about the perceptions of use. And when you move from uses into outcomes, then there is something about learning behaviours. It's the way that it is being used. Yeah, that's what I would call a learning behaviour. So the way that either the learners are using, or the ways that the teachers are using, or both. But there are definitely learning behaviours happening there. So I think what is happening within that area of interface is that the perceptions of use and the learning behaviours, I would argue, are two important factors. So if we have a look at what's happening to that learning behaviour or learning, we can take some examples. Yeah? And I think that these are all relatively easy examples to think about. But if we think about the sorts of learning behaviour that is happening, if it's to do with, let's think about internet research. Okay? Someone is being asked to research via the internet. So what behaviour are they undertaking? They can easily apply search words or terms. They can add to or amend these. They can save links. They can save notes. They can search on demand. And they can do that whenever and wherever there's internet connectivity. Okay? So basically, those are learning behaviours that are happening. If we ask what is happening then in terms of learning, rather than learning behaviour, I wonder how you would answer that. So I'm putting here an indication for internet research of the learning behaviours that are happening. So if you believe those learning behaviours, if you think that they are feasible and reasonable learning behaviours, what learning is actually happening as a result of those learning behaviours? So what is the learning that's happening as a result of applying search words or terms? What learning is happening in order to amend or to save those? What learning is happening for searching on demand, wherever and whenever? And how does that apply to the learning that we value? Or that we measure? Or that we assess or judge? So, if we think of learning, and I'm sorry that this is small, and I'll explain the basic elements of it, but this is a very cognitive view of learning. It breaks learning down into a number of elements. If what we value is, for example, here, oh, that's interesting. Okay, if it's here, in terms of memory, in terms of being able to recall, then if that's the way that we are assessing, if that's the way that we are judging learning, if those are the things that we value, or if what we value is here in terms of analysis or synthesis, if we go back, how do those apply to learning? Is there an automatic link between those learning behaviours and the learning which is being highlighted as being valued or required? And if there is a difference there, how is the difference made up? So if someone is doing internet research and yet the way that it is being valued is through analysis and synthesis, or in terms of memorization and recall, then how is that accommodated? And this, of course, I think is all to do with what Tamim et al. And people like Hattie have said, which is it's the factors around the learner and the technologies which make the difference. So one is then saying, what is it that is influencing the learner in terms of being able to translate this into the learning that's happening, and how are teachers involved in that, or others, peers involved in that? So what I'm drawing out here is that as I see it, what is happening in terms of the technology is not that the technology is focusing upon the learning, which is there. It may be focusing upon searching and summarizing, but it will only focus upon elements of this rather than necessarily all of it, or the elements that we will ultimately judge. So the technology may help with that, but what is certainly happening is the technology is supporting learning behaviours. Those seem to me to be the things that the technology is supporting. On its own, therefore, the technology is unlikely to be able to bring about the outcomes without the learner translating it or those around translating it, which might be teachers or others. So in terms of technology, and if you like, we can think about that in terms of video capture, for example, or think of it in terms of clickers, or think of it in terms of learning by questions, which is a newly created system. Whichever one of these one looks at, actually that linkage follows. So what one can identify are the learning behaviours. And actually, interestingly, I don't know whether any of you look at the ALT fora, the discussion fora that come out. But actually, this very morning, on the ALT forum, there was a discussion about lesson capture and how it's not working, right? How it's not functioning as it was intended to. And my argument for this is this, that basically with video or lesson capture, you're bringing about the potential of learning behaviours, but you're not necessarily bringing about the learning if you don't have the support that goes around it. So if the video capture is not supported by teachers or others in terms of going beyond just checking use, which is just basically a means of going online and checking how many times it's been accessed, if it doesn't go beyond that, then it seems that the translation for the learner from the possibilities of the video capture and their learning behaviours are not going to be translated into learning itself. So with all of these, and one can take others, but with all of these, I believe that link happens. What is starting to happen, however, is that some technologies are now starting to build in the possibility for teachers and those around to be involved to a greater extent. So this, as we go through these, actually there is the potential for a greater involvement of teacher interaction or peer interaction. So if you think about clickers, for example, the usual way of doing that, although from a learning behaviour point of view, clickers enable questions to be asked and to see how others respond, usually what happens is that the teacher or others are also viewing that and are picking up points that are identified by the use of those clickers. So the use of clickers is actually linking, potentially, the learning behaviour through the learning by the teacher. Okay, so what you have is you have some technologies which are enabling that link to a greater extent. And the one that I've seen very recently, and I saw this in use, and this was in a secondary school classroom, was learning by questions. It's a new system where students are given questions on a tablet, and the teacher has network capability with each of those tablets, so that the teacher can actually see at the point of time that those questions are answered, exactly how they are answered, how many retries they have, how many tries they have within a particular point of time. So as I was watching it, there were 20 to 30 students in a class using the tablets. This was for mathematics. And the teacher was looking at the tablet and also actually had the display on an interactive whiteboard of what was happening to each of those students, right? So they could each see each other. And that was also bringing in a peer review process and some level of competitive element. But the teacher was able to see exactly what was happening and where problems were happening, and could actually go and talk to that student at that point in time. So what we're starting to see now are technologies that are allowing those sorts of links between the learning behaviour and the teacher behaviour in order to link it to the learning itself. But what we also have are other technologies that are not doing that without the direct intervention of the teacher. Okay. So let's move on from that. So what is important in all of this? And what is this learning behaviours got to do with where things are going in this respect? I would argue that actually technology-enhanced learning is a specific term which applies to learning. So we're talking there about how digital technologies are influencing, affecting, supporting, interacting with learning. What we're finding from the evidence is that studies are looking well beyond that, at how digital technologies are looking at other ranges of factors. If we think about the range of those factors, I would tend to now identify probably 6 different technology enhancements. So rather than thinking about putting all of these under the same umbrella, I would argue, and particularly from the learning behaviours point of view, that we need to think much more carefully about how we're defining the term technology-enhanced learning and what it means when we talk about other areas outside of that that have influence upon it. So my argument would be that we now need to think about dividing this more carefully, but also that we need to think about that from a methodological and a practical implications perspective. So Technology-enhanced learning seems to me to be very much focused on the learning. What is it that the technology is doing in terms of affecting or influencing the learning? But the other 5, I would say, are technology-enhanced education. So for me, something like online education would be a technology enhancement. But there's also the management of education. So the way in which it is managed. So the ways in which teachers, for example, manage online education. And that's not to do with the learning directly. That's how it is managed. How that education is managed. So what activities are set up, for example. So there's both education and the management of education, and then I think there's the teaching element. So there's technology-enhanced teaching, which actually I think, if, in my view, having looked at the literature and thinking about the literature, there's probably less on technology-enhanced teaching than there is on technology-enhanced learning or management of learning overall. And I think that one of the things that has happened here, maybe, is that technology, the very term technology-enhanced learning, has tended to bring about a focus on the learning and the areas around that learning without necessarily focusing on the teaching and the areas around the teaching. And I think this is particularly true with mobile learning. You know, mobile learning is a very, very common term now. How often do we hear the term mobile teaching? Have you heard it? Once? Twice? Not at all? Yeah? So what we're doing is we are focusing on a particular area without necessarily highlighting that actually the factors around that are ultimately important. And that actually they are the things that make the difference in terms of the effect size, if we go back to this previous literature. So, in my view, we need to refocus this. We need to really think about the ways that our definitions will be used and the implications that they will have. Not only upon research itself, but on methodological approaches and also on the implications for practice. Because certainly, if one looks at the literature with regard to mobile learning, you know, the literature is highlighting practices that are concerned with learning more than they are with teaching. So in terms of identifying practice and support for practice, that is far less there. And then the other one would be then the management of learning. So for me, the management of learning is the learning behaviours would come into this management of learning. So this idea of taking affordances, having perceptions about those in terms of use, and then the ways that those are translated into activities as learning behaviours. So this one for me is ultimately important. But we need a view across this. What does that mean methodologically? I think I would suggest that for folk who are looking at research in this area, we now have to be very, very careful about exactly what it is that we're focusing on and what it is that we're looking at in terms of those additional factors beyond. So if we are thinking about looking at TEL, what do we also need to look at in terms of those other 5? What are the other questions that are important in terms of the effects around that have influence? And that has methodological implications. And it has methodological implications if we go back to that earlier slide about the ways that affordances, uses, outcomes and impact were aligned in terms of methodological approaches. It means that if we are looking through those sorts of lenses, that there are implications methodologically. That ultimately we will need to think about what methodologies that implies for TEL for technology-enhanced learning, if we're looking at this wider perspective? Is this something where we need to think about it in terms of different qualitative approaches, different quantitative approaches, or different mixed methods approaches, and that's at a simplistic level? And why is it that we would want to do that in order to view that? So, for me, the range, if you like, what I believe that we should consider is, what is it that we are doing in terms of defining technology-enhanced learning? What is it leading us to? How do we move away from that so that we can look at the field more productively, more effectively? And what does that mean in terms of methodological implications and implications for practice? So what I've done, I hope, is to give a sort of an outline of my argument on this, and to try to give you some idea of where, from a strategic analysis perspective, I see the need for this field to go. For me, if you like, coming back to that comment that I received in that conference a year or a year and a half ago, to some extent, I actually agreed. It was a VC of a university who made the comment. And it's interesting, because actually in some respects I agree with him, that in essence TEL is something that we have to move on from. But I also disagree that TEL doesn't have a future. But I do think that it has a future in terms of its understanding within a wider perspective, and that we have to understand that wider perspective if we're going to understand things from a TEL perspective. So I was asked 30 years ago if technologies were going to remain the same, and whether I would be in employment in 30 years' time. And I think my judgment on the field now is that basically the next 30 years will be just as productive as the last 30. But I would hope that the field can move on so that we can gain from detail, rather than being entrenched in perspectives that we hold, or that we feel we need to hold. Technology is something that continues to emerge and develop. From a research perspective, we have to move with it. So my argument is that we must not become, as researchers, entrenched in TEL. We must move with it and critically think about it, rather than taking it for granted. Because if we take it for granted, we will not move on, in my view. We will become redundant, as this VC of a university said. So that's the end of my argument.
Great. Thank you. I think we have, wow, you're 15 minutes all there then.
That's okay. I probably expected one or two questions.
Okay, that's great. So just feel free to grab more refreshments, but since we're kind of a bit early, I think rather than taking a break, I think we can just move on to the Q&A session if everyone is happy with that. So now the floor is open for questions and discussions. So if you want to ask a question, please kind of use microphone, so those people who are listening can also be clearly with us. So like this, Brad.
Okay.
And I'll go back to
Okay. Thanks, Don. I really enjoyed that. I think you're making a new contribution to an argument that's been going on for a good while. And it's partly an argument within the research literature, isn't it? But it's also partly an argument between researchers and policymakers who want something from research that research has not been successfully giving them. Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the 90s, I remember this paper, Media Will Never Influence Learning by Mayer, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And that's all about the same kind of thing in some ways that you're talking about. Media doesn't influence learning. It will only ever influence what he calls the economics of learning. Mm-hmm. He's using a different term. Mm-hmm. And so I think the response to that, so this notion you've noticed that most people are focusing on affordances and uses instead of outcomes and impact, is about the reaction to that, which is to say, well, actually, it's the economics of learning, which people have called the practice of learning, that's actually the most important thing. So I don't think that's an accident. I think that's kind of been a deliberate response to criticism by the field. I don't know. So I wonder about your... So really the question is, given that the field's had that relationship with policy making of saying, we want to argue for the importance of what you'd call learning behaviours, and being constantly heckled about producing what you might call outcomes or impact is actually the wrong question. That's what the field's been arguing to policymakers. It seems like you're shifting that narrative a little bit. And if so, how would you see the field taking that challenge on? How would they actually, if you shift the narrative like that, how does the field survive to make policymakers more happy? Do you see what I mean?
I do, and thanks for that question, because it also brings up a point that I was going to make earlier, but didn't make. I think that one of the reasons why we had more outcome or impact related studies 10 or 20 years ago was basically that it was easier to isolate the use of the technology from anything else. Now, you know, I was researching in those times, and going into situations where research was happening, you would find a technology. You would perhaps find a desktop or a number of desktops. You might find that they weren't networked. That's relatively recent. Okay, so you were talking about technologies that could be relatively easily isolated. So from a controlled experiment point of view, it was actually easier at that point to control for the other factors than it is now. What this also means is that the difficulty with outcomes and impact-related studies will remain, but the reasons for it will change. And for me, one of the main reasons why this will change is because of the incredible difficulty of being able to identify a control group. We will find that harder and harder and harder because of the range of contributing factors that there are around. So at one point it was difficult enough to try and account for the control from different teachers' perspectives. That was in itself hard enough. Now we've not only got the teachers to consider, but we've got the online environment to consider. We've got the home environment to consider, etc., because the home environment now is different. It's not just the influence that happens when children go into the home. It's now the influence that the parents have upon the technologies themselves and the effect that they have upon children within the home or students within the home. So the context in which we are working is itself changing quite dramatically. And one of the things I would say about learning behaviours here is also that learning behaviours are themselves shifting. So if we went back to that first one, which was internet research, if we think about that from the point of view of the difference between internet-based research and library-based research, book-based research, there are fundamental differences there. Huge differences, actually. Enormous differences. If we think about the ways in which the technologies are allowing access whenever and wherever, what we are doing in terms of learning behaviours is actually in some respects to move away from concepts of memorization. Yeah? We are enabling ourselves to be more forgetful. We do not need to remember the things we needed to remember. And yet, we may very well be assessing on the same basis that we were assessing 30 or 40 years ago. And yet, we are asking people to forget things more and to access them when they can, when they want, as they wish. So what we're doing is we're shifting learning behaviours as well, and that shifting learning, because we are saying, in essence, that the memorization is less important than the accessibility. And that itself is so what I'm saying here is sort of a very broad way of answering your question, Brett, is we have a different situation from the one that we had 10 or 20 years ago, because the whole context in which we're working has changed. But in my view, we have the same issues. We have the same issues in trying to provide evidence that policymakers want in terms of outcomes and impact, which I think from a research perspective we will find more and more difficult. I think that what it means is that we have to look very carefully at what it is that we can do in this environment, because now the technology ecology is becoming more important than the instances that are arising from single technologies or resources. So the ways that we work now, how many of us do not have a mobile telephone? How many of us do not link one element of data with other elements of data in different repositories? You know, so we're talking about ways in which we are working, which are very, very different. So it's the ecology of those technologies which is becoming hugely important to us, and which we're relying upon to greater extents. And the ways in which we need to look at those in terms of outcomes and impact needs to be different. So what I'm arguing is that we need to rethink methodologically. We cannot remain with the same methodological approaches if we are to examine outcomes and impact. We have to look at that from a different methodological perspective, which could be satisfying to policymakers, or it might not. But from a research perspective, I think we have to look at it. Yeah. Does that answer it roughly?
So we have a question from Yanya.
Yeah. Thank you, Don, for this great presentation, also for this answer, actually. So I'm not a teaching and learning person, but I am interested in political economy of new technologies.
Okay.
And apparently education technology is one of the fastest growing business around the world. So that's why it was quite interesting that you refer to, for examples of internet search and clickers and so on, and not artificial intelligence, new software, huge companies actually developing this. And what was really interesting for me was when reading Ben Williamson's papers, he's writing a lot about how the big companies nowadays owning the big data actually also start owning methodologies, epistemologies, and develop new learning theories as well. So there is a shift apparently away from academia and universities to private companies. So my question then to you is, does this matter? Does it matter who owns this technology, the shift to the big data? And what about the moral economy behind this? So, your last final question, should this not also be the future strategic sort of research topic for us? And the second thing, it just made me think when you nicely developed these 6 different points of technology, enhance, and so on. I'm just wondering if enhance is still the right word, because, to me, enhance means moving it into something better, developing it in something, It is not rather technology supported or managed in different ways, you might have shifting all sorts of ways. So.
Okay, thanks, Yanya. I'll try. I'll try with both of those. I'm going to try for the first one, which is to do with the economic model, economic prospects, where things are going. I think that there's a large amount, I mean, I'll start from a position with regard to artificial intelligence and big data. And the first thing that I would say about that is there's an enormous amount of hype with regard to this whole field. If we look at the ways in which it is potentially affecting, influencing, or workable in terms of education. Whilst big data may very well be workable within certain other areas, within education there are potential limits at the moment where we do not know how we're going to address them. So again, if one looks at the big data area, the focus of big data currently is not actually focused very carefully on learning. It's actually focused more upon the management of learning than it is upon learning itself. So, and this was actually, I can highlight an important case here, which was that there was a very large US-based project set up some years ago called Newton, which was to explore the development of data analysis, of big data, in order to support learning for learners who would be involved in using this system. And basically, it didn't do what they wanted it to do. Basically because they could not find the ways of gathering data about the learning. What they could gather was data about the management of learning or the outcomes of learning, i.e. assessment data, for example. So, yes, companies currently are holding more and more data, and there are large companies and small companies that have huge volumes of data. Some of them have richer sources of data with regard to learning than they do with regard to the management of learning, and vice versa. The ways in which that can be exploited are definitely being seen from a commercial perspective. And at the moment, the ways in which that's happening is usually that companies will work with researchers in order to develop things which then become commercialized. Now, I think that that is increasingly going to happen in education just as much as it has happened in other fields, in other topic and subject fields. And that we have to be prepared for that. So actually, from an educational point of view, I do think that there will, if you like, be opportunities opened up there where researchers will be able to work with commercial partners, but we're not going to be able to move to the same way of working as we have in the past, because the ownership of that data is in the commercial field. So we're going to have to think very carefully. And I mean, I know that this university and other universities are actually in positions to think about what this might mean for the future in terms of how researchers are working and what that means in terms of commercialization, which will benefit researchers and the university as well as commercial partners. And that I think is inevitably a way that we're going to go at the moment, with the way that the commercialization of education, if you want to call it that, is moving. So I think that it is something that's going to continue to develop. I think there are areas where it will need to develop if it's going to be of use to learners and to teachers. But from the commercial point of view, I think that we as researchers also have to be aware that the world is changing, and that we have to be aware of that, and we have to decide what positions we're going to take on that. That we can take one position, we can take another, we can take different positions, but we need to be aware of the possibilities that we can take in that respect. So I don't know whether that answers your first question.
We can debate all day about this, but yeah.
Good, good. And the second one, sorry, remind me of the second one.
About the word enhance.
Ah, yes. That's an interesting one. Actually, I was I was reviewing. It was a Microsoft-based project some years ago where the term enhanced had been replaced by empowered. So they were talking about technology-empowered learning, which I thought was also an interesting term. But yes, the whole term of enhancement has itself been debated, and there are debates on this within the literature as to exactly what that might mean and how it might be defined more carefully, or how it might be categorized to greater extents. So there are some people, for example, who see enhancement as producing more rather than producing something different or something better. Or so one of the terms which is currently being used is the term transformative. But at the same time, not every use of technology is going to be transformative in every situation. So what it might be is replacing. So what you might have is technology replacing certain things rather than empowering or transforming. There was work done about 10 years ago which suggested that we should all be aiming towards transformative processes with uses of technologies. That's now not so prominent. It's not highlighted so much, but it's still there. This idea that ultimately what we're looking for with technologies when we use them is to look at how they are transforming something. Now that certainly isn't a view that's held by everyone. And I mean, I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who's a chief inspector of schools, and he was saying that he's not looking for transformation at all. That what he's looking for is how technology can do something additional. So it can add in some way. It can add time. It can add attempts. It can add in some way, rather than being transformative, changing things in a particular way. But yes, the term is debatable and has been debated, and that would be another discussion that we could have, probably, that would be at least half a day. But yes, I agree that it is a term which just tends to be applied, and I haven't sort of explored that within the talk to any great extent. But there are different ways that different people have sort of tried to think about how to categorize that more. Okay.
Sorry. Just remember from the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, the phrase that predated technology-enhanced learning was technology-assisted learning. It's less ambitious, and I think that often the phrases are just creations of people marketing something. So, enhanced, empowered. I don't know what the next term will be.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, Fred. I think that we tend to gain these terms from particular sources, and then they become sort of used in particular ways. Looking at things like computer-assisted instruction, there were computer-based training. There are huge numbers of terms that have been applied in this field at various times that have had particular uses. And I'm here not arguing for retaining the term tell. What I'm trying to do here is to say that if we are working in a field that we call tell in some way, that we need to think about how we're thinking about the use of that term and what it means in terms of the wider context. But yes, these terms come up, and some of them remain. Some of them are argued against. So there is literature on this, for example. So you can see literature that's argued against things like computer-based instruction, that's argued against things like computer-supported collaborative learning. You know, there are papers and research that have looked at this sort of idea of what the terms mean. One of the things that we don't have within this whole field is we don't have a worldwide agreement on the use of terms. So one of the things that I'm currently looking at, one of the areas that I'm exploring, is the use of computing within schools. And talking to different people in different countries, they have no idea what computing in schools means because their term is informatics. So what you have is you have and actually if you look at the two terms, there is an overlap, but there are some areas that aren't occurring in either one of them. So we do have an issue with terms. And it's really important that we gain some sort of level of understanding in this. How we do it is a question that I certainly would not like to answer. but it's important.
So I will sort of ask that question. Insofar as you've offered a number of terms here, and I thought it was really interesting to open up this technology-enhanced learning and to think about it in different ways. If we're thinking about changing both our sort of perception and use of the term, but also thinking about changing within institutions and how people think about it, how do we set about trying to change the use and encourage people to think, no, I'm not doing research about, or I'm not looking at technology-enhanced learning, I'm actually looking, my question is really about technology-enhanced teaching. How would I measure that impact? And how would I set about trying to set those changes?
Okay. Okay. So there's sort of two parts to your question, Anne-Marie. Okay. Okay. So if in terms of making a change to terminology, this is a very, very difficult one. Some people would say it occurs through advocacy. That what you need is an advocate. And that advocate might be a research advocate, it might be a commercial advocate, but that actually some advocate is required to actually start this process going. And, you know, we have seen this in the research field, that basically there have been researcher advocates that have determined the use of particular definitions and terms very, very strongly. So much so that their influence actually has been enormous. And often that enormous influence has arisen because of the fact that they've been able to take forward the use of the term, which then sometimes is misappropriated actually. But nevertheless it happens. So one way of thinking about this is how do we get advocacy if we want to make those sorts of changes? And how do we bring that about? What sorts of individuals and groups do we need to take on board, and how do we flow that through in terms of wider groups? And undoubtedly, that is difficult. And it's actually not that easy to see why it is that some advocates of certain terms and definitions and concepts have been so successful. You know, especially when there is a research literature that actually argues against some of those concepts and terms, etc. Because you then have to think, well, why is it that they have been so successful and they have determined so much influence if there have been so many questions asked about this, and yet they have. So that's that itself, I think, is a big field. In terms of teaching, if one's looking at it from the point of view of technology enhancing teaching, then the most common methods currently would be to gather evidence from teachers themselves. Now, that then starts to bring in this idea of what are the factors around that. So you can again, this is a very simple way, if you like, of thinking about it. That if you want to look at technology enhancing teaching, you approach teachers, you find out from teachers. But that actually is itself opens up a whole range of questions, because you have to say, what are the influences around that that you need to start to look at? What are the factors that are affecting that teaching and the modus operandi of that teaching, for example? So, you know, the literature that's looking at the reasons why particular teachers take on board particular pedagogies is an important one to consider. And that is certainly going to have an effect upon how teachers perceive the need for developing learning behaviours. So if teachers are adopting particular pedagogies, then actually they are likely to be thinking about identifying learning behaviours in particular ways rather than in others. Do technologies help in that, to that extent? Well, that's in itself a very interesting one. So this learning by questions that I was talking about, looking at that, I would say, yes, that does have the potential to shape and change the ways in which teachers might operate within classroom situations, because they're able to monitor and intervene in a way that they were not able to do before, because of the speed of transactions and the amount of data that they are getting on a dashboard instantly. So I would say that the technology itself there, the affordances themselves, have the potential to bring about changes. I mean, the whole question of how one would research that is a bit big to answer within this forum. But I think basically, yes, one has to focus upon teachers, but there are lots and lots of other factors around that one would need to consider, not least the relationship of the technology itself, the attitudes towards technology, the attitudes towards change and appropriation, etc.
Just from Rebecca, do we have any questions from our online participants? Okay. Do we have any questions from them? Actually, I can ask a very simple question for clarification.
Sure.
So I just want to make sure that I understood this. I mean, it's very fruitful presentation. A lot of thoughts are in my head. So I just want to make sure that I got the most important bit in my view. So based on the slide that you had about 4 origins of evidence, what you were arguing from the beginning and to that point, you're saying that not many study has been done in terms of measuring the impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had this qualitative and quantitative research spectrum, and you were explaining that it's really difficult to measure the impact quantitatively, kind of. And then you move to this pretty much so much more comprehensive framework that we have to consider at least 6 different things to measure the impact. And you mentioned something like it has implication on our methodological choice, so on. Mm-hmm. So my take on can be, so far we haven't really focusing on the impact in very quantitative sense, try to use this quantitative independent control group study, which is not really working properly nowadays anymore, according to Dawn. And then so the impact itself should be it's not only tell, but its impact itself should be really like expensive. I mean, we have to think about the impact and definition of impact much more probably qualitatively. We have impact person there. We do qualitative case studies for impact actually, and then that has some important implication upon different types of methodology we can use to look at. That's my kind of take on that. I'm happy with that. So I'm just kind of, is it the right way to go, or that's in line with what you're arguing here? Okay,
I'll answer that, and then you can tell me if I've answered it appropriately or whether I've missed the point here. Okay. Basically, this is a situation that we have currently. So currently, the field of tell means that we generally have qualitative case studies when we look at affordances and uses, going through to more quantitative studies when we look at outcomes and impact. If you go along with this separation, then you can also, and I haven't done this for this seminar, but you can also think about the alignment of affordances, uses, outcomes, and impact for each of those 6. Now, what it means is that impact on the management of learning is not the same as impact on learning. And clearly, you would be measuring two entirely different things. Yeah? So if you're measuring impact on managing the learning, then what you're wanting to say is, what is it that is being managed? Whereas, if you're looking at it from the point of learning, what is it that is being learned? And one of the really important parts here that I also haven't talked about is, if you identify particular affordances here that lead to uses and outcomes, and then you measure the impact, then that is a clear line of evidence. In other words, the affordances are linked to the uses, they're linked to the outcomes and linked to the impact. And that's viable from a research perspective, because you are measuring, you are looking at apples where you are starting from apples. However, if you talk about, and this is true of a whole range of studies, and I won't mention any particularly, but if you have a whole range of affordances which you don't identify, you know the uses of the technologies, you know outcomes, and you look at impact from the point of view of assessment data, how do you know that the assessment data link to the affordances? So are you measuring the technologies in the first place? What you're doing is you're missing the point of matching apples with apples. You're potentially looking at measuring apples when you've got carrots. Right? So basically what you must have in all of those six is the alignment of affordances through to impact. It is not viable to measure impact if it's not afforded by the technologies, if you're looking at it from how the technology is influencing it. If you're looking at it from the point of view of how those other factors are involved, then they would be involved here. And you'd also need to be looking at how to measure those. Does that, please?
I found that very helpful because I'm a simple person, so apples leading to apples. However, I suppose my big issue with all this impact, which relates certainly to the research that I'm involved in terms of widening participation, as well as this topic here, is that it is very rare that one thing leads to another thing. And we've got multiple things
yes.
that we're attempting then to measure the one thing.
Yes.
And that, for me, is the biggest challenge.
Yes.
The fact that you've broken out for TEL in this particular context to illustrate the range either of things that are operating that will lead to the impact, or a thing that would actually then filter back down to a multiple range and not necessarily learning, but might be something else.
Right.
It's actually really very helpful, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased that helps.
Great.
Yeah?
I think we're kind of hot enough to go. Everyone is like...